Welcome to the Brookings Institution this morning. My name is Ted Gayer. I am the director of the Economic Studies program here at Brookings. I'm delighted to be introducing this event, which will be focused on the major economic issues at play for the 2016 presidential election. Actually, currently our national attention, understandably, is on national security and terrorism, as we saw by the president's speech yesterday. But as the director of economic studies, I'd like to make the argument that the economy is central to the well-being of our country, and it will be, or I hope should be, central to the presidential campaign and to the next president's agenda. So our goal here today is to identify the major economic problems that this country faces and how the various candidates on both the left and the right might go about offering solutions to those problems. Moderating the event is my colleague, David Wessel. He is the director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy here at Brookings. And we have a distinguished panel, Neera Tandon from the Center for American Progress, Doug Holtz-Eakin from the American Action Forum, Glenn Hubbard from Columbia Business School, and Jared Bernstein from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Thank you, all of you, for being here. We very much appreciate it. And thanks bright and early, everyone coming out for this event. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ted. I want to welcome everybody to this event, both in the room and online. We made an agreement before we started that although this event is scheduled to go to 11, even though the clock says 10:30 already, we're only going to keep going as long as it's interesting. So I'll do my part, and then you have to do your part.
Who gets to decide?
I decide. What Ted didn't mention is that each of the people on this stage has been in at least two presidential administrations. Jared was in the Clinton and Obama administrations, Glenn in the first and second Bush administrations, Doug as well in Bush 41 and 43, and Neera in the Clinton and Obama administrations. So we have four people who are steeped in policy, but who also have the political experience of knowing just how much policymakers actually listen to economists. So the goal today is to, not much, right? Yeah. The goal
depends on how the economy's doing.
I see. The goal today is to ask what economic issues should be the subject of the campaign, to explore whether there are shared diagnoses between those who are Republicans and those who are Democrats, and to identify policy responses to these problems, which may differ depending on your partisan views and priors, or may actually turn out to be overlapping. So this is the debate that CNBC did not have. I thought about wearing my Donald Trump wig, but it seemed like in bad taste, so I'm not going to do it. So I want to start with this one. We have an election, we have a winner this time, it doesn't go to the Supreme Court, and a few days after the election, the president-elect calls each of you into the office individually, because he or she can't possibly handle four economists at once, and says, I have a lot on my plate. Putin, ISIS, the Middle East, China, filling out my cabinet, dealing with Congress, which no matter who the president is going to be a pain. But I don't want to neglect the domestic economy, and I know I have to concentrate on something. I can't do everything at once. I know you economists have a 27-point to-do list, but I'd like to know, what do you think should be the very top of my domestic economic priority list? Jared, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is it's really important and underappreciated who you staff your economic team with. I know you're looking for a policy or two, and I'll give you one.
No, one.
Two.
I said one.
Oh, one. Okay, I'll give you one. But I was interested in the Clinton-Sanders debate last time when all of a sudden this argument broke out about who are you going to put on your economics team, and I thought that's actually much more important than people realize, because so much goes on, as I think we probably all would agree, so much goes on at the level before you get to the Oval Office and suggest to the president what you think you should do. I think in terms of policy, what I would probably recommend is a deep dive into infrastructure investment. Something beyond, by the way, what we're trying to do with highways, which is just kind of maintenance. but to take advantage of low borrowing costs, some pockets of still weak demand in the economy, and investments that I think would both help on the slack side of the labor market, but also productivity enhancing in terms of improving the quality of our public goods.
What?
I think for me, the goal is you've got to reset people's expectations. This has been the problem now the past several years, that business people and households have not had their expectations reset positively after the crisis. That's about growth, work, and opportunity. So the one big policy that could address all three of those really is fundamental tax reform. With business tax reform and growth, we have very high implicit marginal tax rates on work for many Americans, particularly lower income Americans, that could be fixed, and a number of pockets that opportunity is discouraged in the tax code. So if growth, work, and opportunity are the lens, the tax reform is the place to start.
And the primary objective of that tax reform would be to raise revenue, to spur growth, to reduce inequality?
To spur growth, to increase opportunities for work and remove barriers for against opportunity in the workforce.
So I like both those, but I guess I'd argue the president should do Social Security reform. And the reason for that is the following. If you take where President Obama will leave us and put it on autopilot, which is basically what CBO projections do, you get to the last year, the second term of whoever is fortunate enough to be elected, and you've got nearly $1 trillion deficits, 85% of which is interest on previous borrowing. So we're headed into a very dangerous fiscal debt spiral, if left unattended. And you have to do something about that. And at the core of that is entitlement reform. And so if you focus on that, you have the following opportunity. Number one, you can make Social Security a much better program. I mean, it is a disgraceful program to say to America's seniors, our plan for solvency is to cut benefits 25% across the board in 20 years. It's a terrible way to run a pension program, and really ought to have been fixed before this. It is also something which we know how to do. Unlike healthcare, I mean, Social Security is not that complicated, and so I believe at least that the large debate over private accounts is behind us, so we can just look at the core defined benefit system, fix it for the long term, and it has to be something that addresses the sort of middle class. This is a key part of the social safety net, and in terms of resetting expectations, I think Glenn's right. People have to have the confidence that their government's doing things that help them again. That's important. It'll have to be bipartisan. And it's important to set the tone early that we're not going to have agendas that are supported only by one side or the other. You're going to have to get something done right at the beginning that's bipartisan to set that tone. So I'd start there.
And you think that, I know that no president would ever turn to you for political advice, so I will.
One non-president did.
Look what happened. Yeah. Oops. Case made. Not to mention the vice president. Forget it. You think a president should come in and say, the only way to fix Social Security is to raise taxes or reduce promised benefits, right? We have to do those things. Why would you put that above doing something like Glenn's spurring economic growth through tax reform?
Like I said, that would be number two. I mean, and it's very close, and I didn't want to just say what Glenn said. So, but I do think the fundamental point is that once you spend the money, you're going to have to pay for it. Everyone always spends all this time talking about how we pay for it, which is tax reform. I'd say get the expectations right about how we're going to spend our money, and the fact that we're going to spend too much. We're in trouble.
Yara?
So I think the election we're going through is a testament to how people's economic concerns are actually primary, and I would say in both the Democratic and Republican primary. I know the Democratic primary probably a little bit better than the Republican primary, and I would say the single biggest issue affecting voters today is the construct of stagnant wages with rising costs that they feel every day. So 15 years of stagnant wages for the bottom 90% is definitely affecting Democratic primary voters. In my view, it's affecting Republican primary voters as well. So I would say to the future president of either party that this country cannot sustain 15 years more of stagnant wages for the bottom 90%, and that should be the focus of the next president's presidency.
That's a diagnosis. What do you do about it?
So, I mean, well, obviously, Hillary has had some ideas in this regard, ranging from profit sharing, supporting profit sharing, incentives for firms, which helps firms actually that are profitable ensure that there's higher income for workers. There's a whole range of ideas like to make the labor market tighter, like infrastructure, et cetera. But I think that the view here should be that should be the focus of the president's term, and then have an agenda around that ranges from lowering college costs, lowering healthcare costs, and raising wages.
Glenn, I think there's a widespread view that Donald Trump has successfully tapped into a vein of anger and anxiety among a set of voters, including a large number of white, working class, non-college educated voters who haven't enjoyed much of an increase in wages. They weren't doing that well before the Great Recession. They haven't done very well since. Now, I think there's a lot of things besides the economy that are bothering them. But if you were looking at the economy and the president came in and said to you, Neera Tanden says I should do something about middle-class wages and incomes, what would you say, tax reform, or how would you sell that to the president?
Well, let me come back first to your question about the Trump diagnosis. I think the anxiety that he is plumbing is about what I would call micro and macro anxiety. Micro anxiety, what are my personal labor market fortunes in the economy? We know they're highly uncertain for the very group that you mentioned. And the other is macro anxiety. What I mentioned that expectations hadn't been reset. Are we going to grow at 2% or 3%? Which is it? And I think that really worries these voters. In terms of what you can do about it, the proposals from Trump not only make the economy worse off, that is reduce GDP, they particularly reduce the fortunes of these very individuals. Anti-trade, anti-immigration, anti-growth policies that will hurt. What would help, I think, are elements of tax reform. I think a much stronger earned income tax credit, particularly for childless workers. I think we need to take a much harder look at work support throughout the economy. And I think that tax reform still matters in the sense of creating opportunity. So I think that the diagnosis Trump is making is real. There are people who are hurting. Unfortunately, his solutions are not only unrelated to, they're actually negatively correlated with those people's success, despite his use of the word management as fixing all problems.
What do you mean by work support policies?
Things that reward work. There are many reasons for us to think about work. I'll say two as an economist and one as a Presbyterian. The first as an economist is obviously work and paycheck. The second and more important economic development is that think of your labor market career as being like a ladder, and you don't get to enter in the middle or top of a ladder. So when we deny lower income people the opportunity for productive work, we've not only denied them income today, we've denied them a future. The third, the Presbyterian comment, is work is incredibly important socially as well as economically. It's defining, particularly for men in society. And the withdrawal of so many men from the labor force, I would argue, is a social, not just an economic problem, and Trump is realizing that.
But when you say work support, you mean government subsidizing jobs for employers so they hire more people, or
no, I mean supporting work that the private sector would have granted. So the earned income tax credit expansions come to mind. My colleague at Columbia, Ned Phelps, has suggested broader kinds of wage subsidies, but they still are subsidizing a decision a private actor would make, not creating jobs.
I mean, I think there's an interesting difference here that we can explore between the view, Glenn's view, a lot of which I agree with, and my own, putting aside the Trump thing, which is a whole other discussion. And that's that I very much agree with the idea that to address the kinds of problems that Neera raised, a more robust system of refundable tax credits like the earned income tax credit for childless adults, as well as expanding some provisions that were put in place in ARA and are actually on the table in the Recovery Act and actually on the table right now. So there's a political agenda to do what Glenn is suggesting. By the way, work supports in my world mean specifically things that help low-income people get and keep a job. So it might be childcare. It might be help with transportation. It might be help with health care. It's certainly some human capital investment. All of those are work supports. But the thing is, I don't think you can achieve the goal that I think Neera correctly identified for the next president strictly through these kinds of redistributional measures. So here I'm sounding maybe a little bit more like a Republican than a Democrat.
Keep going.
You can't go to Congress every year and say, well, there's more inequality, so we need more ETC, more CTC, more work supports. We have to continually ratchet up the redistribution function, and you especially can't do that if you're pursuing some of the tax ideas that I suspect some of the people on this panel, not me and not Neera probably, some of the tax ideas that will that will reduce the revenue base. So you also have to be mindful of the primary distribution. You can't do everything through the fisc. You have to pursue policies that will tighten up the job market enough so that middle and low income people have more bargaining clout, more bargaining power, so that their paychecks begin to rise more in step with productivity before you get to a redistributive solution.
Can I just follow up on the...
Let's start with Glenn and then Neera,
Yeah.
and then you get a chance.
I want to come in on this, but also by agreeing with something Jared said earlier when he pointed to infrastructure. This is an example of what I was saying about resetting expectations. One of the errors the Obama administration made, in my view, in infrastructure was the targeted, timely, temporary mantra, the shovel-ready mantra, when what was needed was resetting expectations, a long-term commitment. I think that would be a very good idea. I don't think it principally for the demand reason, although I think it will help there, but I think it will help in terms of resetting expectations. So I'd throw that in as an agreement.
Let me go to Doug. He can get a shot at this one.
Oh, that's right.
No, go ahead.
So I want to just echo what Glenn just said on the infrastructure piece. I mean, I was on a bipartisan Transportation Reform Commission a while back, and our problem has been that we worry about gas tax versus non-gas tax financing, which is a sort of a sideshow in my view, and we just try to put more money into the existing structures. These structures need deep reforms, and we need to spend this money much more effectively and get better infrastructure and look at it as a long-term issue, not a short-term stimulus.
To go to the middle class wages.
So then the second thing I would
Social
say,
Security reform.
necessary condition is that we grow more rapidly. I want to 100% agree with Glenn on that. If you look at the U.S. in the post-war period, per capita income grew rapidly enough, so GDP per capita, that the standard of living doubled roughly every 32 years. So that meant in a person's working career, you could imagine reaching the American dream, whether that was sending a child to college or buying a home or getting vacation, whatever that might have been, that was a lifetime feasible thing. Given the projections for future growth coming out of the CBO and population growth, that's now 58 years. So the American dream's way off in the horizon. And
But people are living longer, so it could still...
Yeah. A necessary condition for success is going to be more rapid top-line growth. The best anti-poverty program we've ever seen, it's like the late 90s, is tight labor markets, drawing people in and raising their ability to work and
Great. So the president says, I agree with you. I want to increase growth.
So
what are you going to do?
So do the tax reform, do the entitlement reform, because right now we are on an anti-growth path. I mean, we're headed into a debt spiral. That's an anti-growth thing. You can't solve that by raising taxes, right? We're going to have $1 trillion deficit. We need $1 trillion a year in higher taxes. So you're going to have to control the outlay side of the ledger. You're going to have to do the things that spur work and growth.
I'll get back in a minute. Neera.
Yeah, so just to follow up on what Jared's saying, I want to totally emphasize the pre-distribution problem, but to bring it back to the primary.
When you say the pre-distribution, you mean the market distribution of income?
Yeah, the market distribution of
income.
Right. And it from this work we did on the Inclusive Prosperity Commission report, I think there is a theory in the United States that there are just these global trends and there's nothing we can do about them. But actually, if you look at other countries, we have a particular pre-distribution problem in the United States. So other countries are able to produce market wage gains for the middle class better than we are. We've had stagnant wages over the last decade. Other countries, Australia and Canada, as well as the Nordic countries, but not just the Nordic countries, have been able to produce those gains. I think that's for a variety of forces, one of which is that workers have more power and at the lower end of the income gain. But I think if you actually, I don't like Donald Trump, I'll say that right now. I think a lot of his message is abhorrent, but if you actually look at the language he has about trade, corporate profits, I think one of the single challenges we have right now, and is disillusioning to both many Democratic and many Republican voters, is that corporate profits are very high and workers' income is very low. And so this breakdown between profitability of firms productivity in the economy, and workers, for the bottom 90%, ability to garner any of those benefits is definitely disillusioning about the kind of promise we think the American dream offers.
Just a quick thing I want to say.
And
By the
I
way,
think
Donald
that
Trump,
is happening on both sides.
Donald Trump very weirdly said recently, the problem is wages are too high, which was a very confusing
Donald
thing.
Trump weirdly said recently is a sentence that could
everything.
apply to many things. But Glenn, I wonder if you could speak to Neera's point. So Neera's suggesting there's something about the current state of American capitalism that the rewards are going more to capital and less to labor, and that there are things that government policy can do to strengthen the hand of labor. Do you find that analysis compelling or not?
I think at the 50,000-foot level, yes. Closer to the ground, no. So I do think there are global forces. I would put technological change at the top, followed by globalization, that are leading to these trends. They're not American trends, they're global trends. But I do think there is a significant reason to be concerned. To my mind, it's about empowering the skills of people who are emerging into the economy, trying to get a job. And we've failed with that, not only in the educational system, but what I would call vocational training as well. That's where I would be putting my emphasis, much less on concern about how many billionaires there are. I suspect if I ask this audience, would you like to have 50 more Bill Gateses or Steve Jobs? I suspect you'd probably say yes. I don't know, even though that might increase inequality. I think the concern is not so much inequality, but the lot of the least well-off.
Yeah, so I just need to respond to that. I just to be fair here. I actually completely agree with you. In the 1990s, we had rising inequality, but people weren't as angry about it because the bottom 90% were getting some of the gains. The problem I completely agree that the argument about too many rich people versus too many poor people can be stilted. We can be concerned about that. But the problem we have in this economy is that the middle class and the poor are not gaining from economic growth. And it's like factually based that most of the wealth is moving to the top. And I think the reality of that is that I hope we can all agree that it would be great if we could get more economic growth for the bottom 90%, but I think we should recognize that it is a problem that it is going all to the top.
So I think there's, in fact, I know because Brookings and AEI last week put out a report of a commission that they put to try to come up with a bipartisan approach to alleviating poverty and helping low-skilled workers. And that recipe, I think, is agreed upon on both the left and right. It has to do with the skills, that whether they're academic or vocational. It has to do with family structures and making sure that people don't have children too quickly and before they're prepared to. And there's a recipe there, but it's going to take a long time. If we get a really good education reform, in 18 years we'll start to see the fruits of that as people enter into the labor force. And so the political system doesn't have a lot of patience for that. I think that's important work, and the next president should be able to walk and chew gum, and so do the things that we're talking about for top line, but also take care of this stuff which is so essential for the long run success.
So can I weigh in on
please.
this discussion? So there's just so much on the table here, as one might have suspected. I want to try to bring it back down to this idea of what you recommend to the president. I don't think that you can, again, get too high up in your altitude in terms of 50,000 feet when you're thinking about these issues, especially at the level of advising the next president. So the idea that there could be a bunch more rich people is not anathema to me or anyone up here. But it's not just because they're really skilled or they come up with a great new idea like Steve Jobs did. There is an inequitable structure built into the economy right now such that many of the folks that we're talking about here are extracting significant rents, meaning levels of profitability that go way beyond what efficiency would dictate. So if we're going to have more inequality and more millionaires and billionaires, we're going to have to make sure that they're taxed accordingly so that we have the revenues we need to do the kinds of things we're talking about here, whether it's work supports, whether it's wage subsidies, whether it's more training, whether it's infrastructure. So that's part one. But I also think I would advise the president to take steps to dampen the kinds of rent seeking that we've seen, particularly in the financial sector. And actually, there are ideas on the table that both Clinton and Sanders have put forth that I would endorse that have to do with strengthening financial market oversight.
Yeah, on this point, I think that I'm not terribly sympathetic to where you started on the tax piece, but I'm very sympathetic on competition policy and rent seeking. We need to have a competition policy that makes sure that if you get rich in America, it is because you had a better idea that's sustainable for some period of time, not simply that you've been able to successfully use the state to block people out. The financial services industry has had a lot of rent seeking. And I do think we need to focus like a laser on rent seeking and competition.
How about
policy.
a state tax?
Can you just for people who don't know, define rent
the
seeking?
Reagan thing.
Define rent.
Rent seeking would be using, rather than using if Jared and I are competing with one another, using our competitive smarts to fight, I go to the regulatory authorities and try to use them to block him.
Probably the only way you could win that fight.
For sure.
You go to the moderator and
The
you have them cut Jared
former
off.
way is good, the latter way is socially very costly.
So this is one of the reasons that I, at least, am concerned about Trump and other businessmen in political life. In my experience, in 2 White Houses, and on a campaign especially, you get these very successful business people. They roll in, they want to dictate what policy is going to be. Well, they got successful largely by creating monopolies, and so their idea of good policy is let's create a bunch of monopolies, and it's a disaster. And so we do actually have to have use our regulatory apparatus to enhance competition, not to restrict it. And generally, that's not what they're for.
Glenn, you have talked about aspirational goals and raising the expectations of America, and that seems like a good idea. We certainly don't want to have the opposite. But can you explain exactly how you look at this 4% growth target in the Bush plan? And is it just a goal to make us feel better so we try harder? Or do you think that over the next, say, 5 or 6 years, we could actually achieve 4% growth?
Let me try to unpack that in a couple of parts. I think over the course of a recovery, the one that we went through, we could have grown faster. Typical recoveries have faster growth. With better policy, we would have faster growth, even 4%. If you're asking me a longer-term question, do I think the U.S. economy can grow over the next 50 years at 4%? I think that'd be a real stretch. To me, the debate, and it's still huge for our economy, is do you believe with the gospel of secular stagnation that we're stuck at 2% or less? Or do you think the high 2s or 3% are possible? Over a generation, those are vast differences. That's the debate we need to be having. I would salute any politician who aims for a high number and says, let's go there, as long as he or she can connect it to the American people on what that means. But growth should be the center of this debate, 2, 3, or whatever your number is.
Can I say, so I think that that's, I think that this whole growth discussion is somewhat unfortunate in the following sense. I mean, it's great to aspire to higher growth rates, as David suggested, but you don't really have a realistic discussion, especially among, somewhat technocrats that are up here on the stage, unless you actually break down what it is you're talking about. Otherwise, you get, Bush saying 4 and Huckabee saying, I'll raise you, and going for 6, and who
Trump's
knows?
at 10.
Yeah, okay, well, there you go. So it's all about, very simply, it's all about productivity growth and the growth of the labor supply. I mean, that is a very simple and worthy economic identity to keep in your head. So if we're talking, we can talk all day about aspirations, but we really have to talk concretely about what will boost either productivity growth or labor supply. And there, I think, we're into, again, some of the granular things we were trying to get to before, whether it's ideas that would help get us to full employment, ideas that would diminish rents and thereby increase efficiencies. I'm happy to talk about tax reform, though I think we have very different ideas about that. Again, I think at the heart of tax reform, we need new revenue so that we can improve our infrastructure, which would be productivity enhancing. There's an immigration debate in there vis-a-vis labor supply. So those, to me, are the granular directions to go in.
Yeah, on productivity, I think Jared's absolutely right. So let's frame it. The post-war halcyon days of productivity till the early 70s had labor productivity 2.5, 2.6%. There was a period in the early 2000s matching that. Later numbers are about half that. The question is, what's possible for the American economy? I would argue that going back to those better days is easily possible. Part of what we are seeing, I think, is a hangover from the financial crisis. Part of it is measurement. To be candid, we have a steel and wheat national income account system for a very different economy. And part is the fact that I think we're still at early stages of the development of a lot of the general purpose technologies that we have. So I think there's every reason to be optimistic about productivity. Even on hours worked, which I think people tend to think of as immutable, I don't think so. We can encourage older workers to work. We can help low-income people work. So I think on both those margins there's optimism, particularly productivity.
Yara, can we turn to tax reform? So Jared has made the point that we need tax reform to raise revenue. Glenn has made the point that the most important goal in tax reform is to get the economy growing faster. Where do you think if we were going to do tax reform, either business or personal or both, what should be the objectives?
I mean, to me, they're not an either or, actually. I mean, to me, I think the idea of tax reform is to ultimately have the revenue base that you need, but also foster economic growth over the long term and ensure that you have we do actually have to ensure that we have equitable distribution. We should also ensure in tax reform that some of the things that are actually forms of rent seeking, the tax code is one of the ways in which people are rent seeking. Those we eliminate, right? So the tax code favors some business over others. That all should get very much streamlined. We probably have a disagreement about whether you can really be revenue neutral for corporate tax reform or not.
Well, your view is that we should not be. Your view is we should raise revenue. Corporate tax, business tax reform should raise revenue. Correct?
Yes, my view is that corporate taxes as a share of revenue have declined, and that I think most people in America would find it odd that at a time where corporate profits are high, we actually are being less contributed to
If we did
revenue.
individual tax reform, that should be also raise revenue or not?
Individual tax,
Yeah,
yes, we should raise revenue at the highest rates to ensure that we actually have
So-
what we need to do.
So I'm with Glenn in that I think you can't do everything in tax reform, and that's one of the things that happens is you start trying to do too much. So figure out what you want, and I think that the primary objective should be growth. That's our greatest problem at this point in time, and you should design the tax reform to do that. You will have other distributional objectives. You have other things to take care of them. We have lots of programs on the outlay side for that. So I think that's the key. As a matter of just the realism, I think number one, the route to higher revenue, which I know some on the left want, is through tax reform. If you will not raise more revenue using our broken tax system, and so you've got to get something done on the tax reform side. And for the Republicans, I would say the following is the state of play. As much as we might want tax reform, it is at the moment a discussion among the elites. I mean, if you go back to the '86 reform, it began in the '70s with Bill Bradley and Dick Gephardt on the left saying the American tax code is harming us. It's making it bad for Americans, and we need to fix it. And on the right, Jack Kemp and Alvin Roth, others. And it took 10 years and a president running for re-election to make that sale at the retail level that the average American believed that tax reform would be good for them. That sale has not been made in the U.S. And it'll be interesting to see in this cycle if Republicans can make that case. Because if they don't, we're not going to see tax reform, not on the individual side.
There's nothing I hate more in this policy debate than the U.S. tax debate. I just think it's terrible. I think it's incredibly puerile. The idea that you can, we can argue about how we should fund the transportation system. Doug has some interesting ideas. But the idea that you can have the transportation system you want on a federal gas tax, which funds the Highway Trust Fund, which has stayed where it was in nominal terms since 1993, is magical thinking. And I blame both sides now. And here, if I'm recommending a president, I probably get fired pretty quickly because I found it, I think, very off-putting when Bernie Sanders said, I have this, really very massive progressive agenda, but, I'm going to pay for it. And Hillary Clinton said, well, you're going to raise taxes on the middle class, and said, I pledge not to raise taxes on anyone above $250,000. Now, that's the top 3% of the income distribution. So the tax debate at this point is so horribly cramped that if you're a Republican, and I'm not necessarily talking about the guys up here, because I think some of what they're saying is resonant.
But only some.
Only some. If you're a Republican, you're saying, well, we can't raise taxes. In fact, we're going to lower them quite massively. If you actually look at the plans that the Republican candidates put forth, I'd say very inconsistent with everything you've heard up here today, including from the Republicans. And if you're a Democrat, you say, well, you can only raise taxes on the top 3%. Now, I'm not running for office, and Secretary Clinton is, and she knows things I don't, and maybe that's how you have to get elected nowadays. But that still makes it a ridiculously cramped debate, and I think we can't possibly get to where we need to go. Just on demographics alone, forget about new ideas.
So Glenn, so Neera and Jared are arguing that we have to increase tax revenue. And I think they mean increase it as a share of GDP.
Yeah.
You agree or not?
I don't, but it's because I want to get back to where Doug started this discussion this morning. The primary fiscal policy decision is spending. Taxes and borrowing, now we're talking about mechanics of paying for the primary decision. American people have to decide the size and scope of government. If we want the government that we're on autopilot, we will have to have much higher revenue, and I mean much higher revenue. And the notion that it could come from the top 1%, 2%, or 3% is fanciful.
I agree with that.
And so basically, that's the choice we have to make. Tax reform is, once we've decided how big and how broad we want government to be, what's the best way to do it? To me, a broad-based consumption tax gets at both sides issue. It's the lowest efficiency costs, and the largest states, i.e. European welfare states, are funded principally from such a tax. But I think we need to be clear that while we all like to talk about tax reform, in some sense, the voters have to make the decision about government first. Then we can talk about taxes.
Okay, let's turn to that. One of the drivers of future deficits is healthcare spending.
Correct.
So have we done enough to restrain the growth of healthcare spending? Or if not, what more do we need to do?
Why is that the right answer? To me, if you look at the other 5/6 of the economy, traditionally we talk about value. So if you ask what share of GDP is the men's suit market, we don't pay a lot of attention to that because we assume the market gets it.
So you think we're getting good value for our healthcare dollars?
I don't, but that's the pivot that I want to make. It's not to me about what share of GDP it is, but about value. I think we've made some improvements both in the public sector and the private sector in recent years that have taken level effects out of healthcare costs, reducing the importance of third-party pay at the margin, high deductible plans, greater copays, all of that is there. The American people have to decide how much other restraint they want. A lot of the growth in healthcare spending comes from technological improvements. In most of the economy, we don't think about having the latest and greatest because we can't afford it. But in healthcare, we all feel that way. So we really have to have that discussion. But I think there's more we could do in the way we finance healthcare and in the structure of care and insurance markets to continue to take level effects down, although I'm skeptical that we're going to change the rate of growth that much.
Neera? Healthcare.
I would note that the dramatic declines in the deficit have been in large measure fueled by our lower healthcare costs over the next decade.
Slowdown in the growth.
The slowdown in the growth of healthcare costs, but in CBO terms, it's real money. So I think the challenge we're seeing, if Doug disagrees with that as a former CBO director, that's
There's no real money there, but go ahead.
We have seen year-to-year deficit declines from the same thing. So I think the reality here is that clearly we can have a lot more value in our healthcare system, and the system is, the optimist note is that the system is reforming itself in many ways. The structures are transforming so that we are creating incentives in the private sector to lower healthcare costs. Here, this is an interesting challenge, right? So from CAP's perspective, we were looking at the fact that people are still so focused on healthcare costs, right? If you ask people their number one healthcare concern, it's high healthcare costs. At the same time that we've had national healthcare expenditures moderate, and the rate of growth has been at a historic low. So let's unpack that, and it actually gets to something that was just referenced. People feel like their healthcare costs are high because their healthcare costs are high because of high deductible plans. Deductibles have actually increased dramatically. They've gone from an average of $200 to $1,000 in over a decade. This incentive structure we wanted to create, which is have people own their healthcare costs, is also driving their anger at the healthcare system, right? They're paying more and more for their healthcare costs, and employers are shifting costs to them. Now, the positive of that is everyone has skin in the game. The negative of that is, as a policy matter, that there are people who are not using the healthcare system who should because of high deductible plans. But also, it's another way in which workers feel, with very little voice in the system, that they are just kind of getting the shaft. If you look at national health expenditures, the people capturing the reductions are employers and providers. Workers are last. So this is just another way in which we have to really think about
Right, so I'm
not
lost
only
here.
how we do
So
this.
it's the policy prescription to make people pay more for their insurance, so they have even more incentive, to somehow make them pay less, to do, what would you do differently than what we've done before to right this balance? Not what people feel, but what the policy should be.
Well, in my view, the actual policy should be that when we have national health expenditures decline, both employers and employees should benefit from that. But because workers have little bargaining power, employers are able to capture the gains. I'll send you a paper on this topic that we did. So I think the issue here is,
What lever do you pull?
what lever do you pull? You can use transparency. The fact that people don't really have clear transparency on their benefits and the value of their plans year to year is one way to pull it. But I think the issue here is we definitely need to have national health expenditures lower. The challenge I think we have to think from a policy perspective is ensuring that everyone gains from that, not just employers and providers.
So Doug,
Come back in on this, because I just don't buy. I was born in 1958. So if you gave me a choice between 1958 healthcare at 1958 prices and today's healthcare at today's prices, I will choose today's healthcare and today's prices, even though the theory of price deflators says I should be indifferent. That says that on average, there's been a lot of quality improvement in healthcare. So on average, that statement can't be right. What we want is at the margin for it to be right. And that's why these incentive effects are, but the notion of health expenditures higher or lower, these kind of average statements, those aren't right.
But how do you
Shared
compare
GDP.
that to every other country? I mean, they have
Yeah,
other countries have high-value healthcare plans and spend.
She's talking as a share of GDP.
Yeah.
Obviously.
right.
I mean,
but they've made
obviously.
Well, wait a
So-
second. Can I weigh in here? Look, I want to just say that, for the record, I think that Obamacare, is working really well and having much the intended effects that those of us who helped in its architecture believed it should. But moreover, I wager that any replacement plan that all of those who want to repeal Obamacare, and I'm not sure where you two guys are, Glenn and Doug, but I suspect you're in the repeal camp. I suspect that that the architecture of any plan that we really haven't heard much about, because it's always repeal without much of a replacement, would be very much the same. Because if you're going to cover more people, you have to have a risk pool. And if you're going to have a risk pool, you have to have a mandate. And if you have a mandate, you're going to have some sort of subsidy to help people who can't afford to meet the mandate. Now, you can tweak it on the sides, and I know the Republicans want to do this, by covering fewer people and making it cheaper. And that's the kind of decision I think Glenn was just honestly talking about. But let's flesh that out. I mean, it's one thing for Glenn, I think, to very accurately say, we've got to have an honest discussion with, quote, the American people, whoever they are, that says you can't have this much for that much. And that's what I hear, especially the Republicans, I must say, saying to people, whether it's health care or pretty much anything else.
All right, but Jared, so I think it's clear that the primary objective of the Affordable Care Act was to insure more people.
Which it
has
has
done that,
does.
right? But if the objective is to do as Glenn suggests, to get more value for the money we spend, or as Neera suggests, to contain the share of GDP in healthcare, are you persuaded that what's happened is all because of Obamacare and we just have to kind of keep going and be patient and everything will be okay? Or do you think there's more we have to do to squeeze value out of what we spend?
I think that I think there's probably more. I'm sure there's more we have to do to squeeze more value out of our healthcare dollar. We're not there yet, and I think I'm with Neera where I think she was going. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that we spend 17, 18% of our GDP on healthcare. Other countries spend 8 or 9%, and it looks like their quality is pretty much analogous to ours.
Or better.
Simply by that, or better. So simply by that metric, we have a long way to go. So we have to do more squeezing. My point is that the type of squeezing that we're doing in the ACA is really the only type of squeezing you can do. Now, you could try to have more skin in the game, and that might be more squeezy, but I think that would violate our kind of living standards ideas that we've talked about. You look confused. You want me to elaborate what I'm saying?
No, if you squeeze out unnecessary care, you haven't hurt my living standards.
No,
the trick is to get the incentives right.
No, I'm saying that one way you could do that is to raise deductibles and give people more skin in the game. That would help. At one level, that would help increase efficiency, but the cost would be that people would be.
And so your alternative is
to continue doing what we're doing.
Okay.
So on this topic, I'd like to say one big picture thing about how this is going to play out, because this is, I think the political economy, this is really going to be very interesting. As I said, the autopilot is unacceptable. Every candidate who's running right now, no matter what they're saying, has some nerdy guy like me running around saying, sir or madam, very bad in 2024. Your legacy will be very bad unless we change course. Got to do something about it. So in the next 8 years after the election, there's going to be the need for changes in these entitlement programs, no doubt about it.
Yeah, well, I'm
And
sorry,
there will
what
be-
is
let me
this?
finish.
Social Security, or what is
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid,
Okay.
federal health programs in particular. I want to come back to that. That's the detail. So that changes completely the dynamics we've seen in this town, because we're going to have, by necessity, White House leadership on this, because that's going to define the legacy. And it's not going to be a choice. The president's going to have to do that. And so that makes it way easier for Congress, who need that kind of air cover, to be able to go back and say the president asked us to do this, didn't want to do it, and the president sends up proposals and they say, oh, they're all wrong, we fixed them, we're brilliant people. And that helps the Congress function tremendously. At the grassroots level, there's a huge demand now for entitlement reform, which has never been true. There's never been anyone who's for entitlement reform except me, budget geeks. The lines diverge, I'm very upset, let's do entitlement reform. Real people didn't want entitlement reform, but now the defense and non-defense communities know they're not going to get any money. I mean, we've codified it with the caps, but it was a budgetary reality before that. There's no money for them unless the entitlement programs get put in a box and under control. And so we now have
A lockbox.
whatever. We
That worked well.
We have advocates for entitlement reform now. I mean, there's the defense community. It's clear they're there, believe me. But there's also the non-defense community. And I actually spoke on this topic to the Non-Defense Discretionary Coalition, the single worst named coalition in Washington. I mean, honestly. But they understand this. So this is a good discussion to have, because we are actually going to go through this as a nation.
Right,
I want to finish. Here's the detail, right? The levers you can pull to really fix things are, number one, Medicare, which is the biggest payer in the country and dictates practice patterns all across America, and that's where low-value, fee-for-service medicine comes from. And so you've got the levers, and the great disappointment, I'll use that word, of the Affordable Care Act is that because it used Medicare as so much of the pay-fors and became so politically toxic, we've had Medicare reform stalled for a long time. We need to get out of that and start doing better on Medicare. And I'm happy to go through the details, so I won't bore you now. Same is true for Medicaid. Medicaid's not a great program, yet it's the core of the expansions. Indeed, it's going to turn out to be the dominant part of the ACA expansions, because the exchange pools have stalled, and that they have a questionable future, since the young and healthy didn't show up, and now they're not showing up. So, Medicaid reform is going to be really important. Those are the levers to pull.
Okay, I want to raise two other issues before we turn to the audience. The first is the Fed. So the Fed is clearly going to raise interest rates in December and is promising them to raise them gradually thereafter, subject to revision. Is that the right thing for the Fed to do?
Well, I think the Fed should have acted even earlier, but my concern for the December meeting is not whether they will or won't, because I think they almost surely will, but we still don't have a roadmap for where policy goes. And I say roadmap deliberately. There's currently a rules versus discretion argument about the Fed, that members of Congress want a firm rule. The current Fed is just absolute discretion. I think in between is a roadmap where the Fed says, here's where we're going, here's the destination, here's the best route. over time, if the best route changes, we'll tell you and we'll talk to you about that. That's just not a conversation we're having from the Fed. So I hope that as soon as we see the rate hike in a week's time, we start to see that discussion.
What do you mean by a
missing.
road? So you don't think they should write the Taylor rule into law?
I do not.
Okay, so what is it you think they should do
I
differently?
think they need to tell us what they're looking. Are we looking for a particular neutral real interest rate? Are we looking for a particular outcome in the labor market? What are we looking for?
You don't think saying we're looking for 2% inflation is sufficient?
I don't, and that's not the Fed's mandate. That's the ECB's mandate. The Fed actually has multiple things that it's supposed to be doing, and it really hasn't articulated to the Congress exactly what that roadmap is. Now, inside the Fed, the view is, well, discretion gives us the flexibility to respond, but I would argue it gives way too much flexibility, and unfortunately invites the political attacks on the Fed that we're seeing right now.
Okay.
Well, I think Glenn is raising a bar that is interesting at one level, but unrealistically high in a way that I'll get to in a second. I think if you look at the indicators of the kinds of decision points that the Fed makes, it's actually harder than you'd think to justify even a small rate increase at this point, even a quarter point, which is what we're likely to see in a few weeks. Not only is the Fed missing its 2% inflation target, but they're increasingly missing that target, and they've been so for many years. There's still an output gap, meaning actual GDP is 3% below potential GDP. That's north of $500 billion right now. And if you look historically, the Fed has consistently held at low rates, even zero, when they're faced with these kinds of gaps. That said, I've written a ton about this. My blog, jaredbernsteinblog.com, I commend to you.
But you don't have to send money. It's not like a political campaign, right?
Yeah. No, it's free.
Just checking.
Yeah, free advice, worth what you pay for it. I've written a lot about this, and I was recently pointing out, I wrote a piece called The 7-Year Itch, which it's going to be on December 15th. It's going to be exactly 7 years from when the Fed went to zero. I think that given the forward guidance and given this big decision of when are we going to lift off or not, I've come to live with this idea that there's going to be a 25 basis point increase. I think what matters after that is the path, which I believe should be data-driven and shallow. And then now let me get to my critique of Glenn's point. Your request is not at all unreasonable. The problem is economists just don't know. The Fed economists don't know, and they've got hundreds of the smartest there are. They don't know what the full employment rate is for unemployment. They don't know what the neutral rate is for the interest rate. It's moving around. They think that temporary factors having to do with energy prices and the strength of the dollar are jamming the system, but the Phillips curve, which has been the long-term workhorse, the kind of decision rule that the Fed has used, is
the Phillips curve being the relationship between wage inflation and unemployment.
Yeah, or price inflation and unemployment, and these relationships have broken down. So I am talking to an august macroeconomic professor here. Macroeconomics
doesn't seem to have restrained you at all.
Yes, I am unrestrained in my critique of the current state of macroeconomic thinking. Macroeconomics is in a very tough way, and honest Fed economists will tell you as much.
Just to come back on this, I think we're asking way too much of the Federal Reserve. And in fact, to get at any of the issues that Jared rightly points to, these are issues for the government and for fiscal policy. I don't know of anyone who believes that the current cost of capital is restraining business people's eagerness to invest. Agreed. And so I don't think that Fed policy is that meaningful in that regard. My concern is that next spring, we're probably looking at an unemployment rate of, call it 4.7%, with a reversal of commodity moves, inflation back at 2%, and an economy growing at its potential, at least as CBO would define it, or maybe even a little above. Is that an economy on life support for monetary policy? And at the same time, we're sending all kinds of crazy signals for credit allocation. I have the same economic fears that Jared has. They're just not solvable by monetary policy.
The only thing I'll say about that is that every forecast, at least from the Fed and other private forecasters as well, for inflation doing the kind of turnaround that Glenn just suggested, have been wrong for literally 7 years running.
Okay, I was going to change the topic unless you guys feel, all right? You want to talk about the Fed?
I want to say I'm worried about the Fed as an institution. I would agree with what Glenn said by and large. I think if we wrote out the next 2 years of GDP growth, unemployment, and inflation with perfect foresight, no one would know what the Fed would do. And that's a problem.
Why do you think?
But my bigger concern is that the Fed was once the preeminent monetary authority on the planet. There wasn't any question about that. And through the crisis, and in the crisis, I thought it was our best policy response, period. Did more than anything else. Forget TARP, forget all that stuff. Did a great job. Yet it now finds itself in all sorts of political hot water. And that bothers me. I think its independence is very much at risk. One of the mistakes, I believe, of Dodd-Frank was to turn the Fed into an uber regulator, which expanded its role. And when the regulator get upset with the regulator, they now have a court of appeals called the U.S. Congress, which invites the Congress reaching into the Fed. So the current dynamic, I think, is quite unhealthy.
And why do you think Republican candidates have been so harsh on the Fed? Two of them wanted the gold standard. I think no one ever stands up and says,
I am not a psychologist. I have no idea.
Okay.
I guess I would just broadly agree that obviously governmental policies, we have a situation where, truthfully, we have a dysfunctional Congress and a dysfunctional Washington, and the Fed is stepping in a response. And I think it's weird that our response to that is the Fed is terrible. What's really truthfully happening here, there are things the government should be doing instead. Obviously, everyone on this panel agrees we should do infrastructure investment. That would tighten up the labor market. Yet no one has been able to get that accomplished in Washington. And truthfully, the Fed is responding because no one else is responding, in truth. And so it would be great.
The highway bill. They did.
No, I agree. Okay, great.
All right, one more question, and we'll turn to the audience. When Bill Clinton was elected 25 years ago, I don't think that he had to look at China as a major economic rival to the United States to the extent it is today. It's clearly something that both American workers and business worry about. What do you like about our current policy to China, and what, if anything, would you recommend that the next president do to make sure that we have a healthy competition that leads to better lives for both the Chinese and the Americans, and not a tilted one? You want?
I think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement is a very important step, and I guess that would be the number one. I'm not super fond of many of the businesses' view of China as this sort of nice, friendly market where they can go make a lot of money. I think that the Chinese they don't share our values. They're playing a long game for world supremacy, and I do not view them as anything like an ally. And I think historically we have been at our best in those circumstances, Soviet Union comes to mind, when we have knitted together an alliance of those who have a set of shared values on both economic and more strategic concerns. And I think TPP is exactly that. I would love to believe that the tremendous post-war GATT and WTO rounds were driven by realization that trade's great and economists were right, but it really wasn't true. It was driven by fear of the Soviet Union, and I think we have to think about China in the same way.
I would say that we have wasted a lot of policy time, economic policy time, with China by focusing entirely on the currency for years and across multiple administrations of both parties. China's big concern for China and for the world, I think, are the rot inside its financial system and domestic economy. First of all, China's debt levels are extraordinarily high. It's very hard for an emerging economy to have a happy ending in the situation China is at. But my biggest concern for policy is that, and I agree with everything Doug said on the TPP as a counterpoint, but my biggest concern is that economists like to say, well, in the long run, we know China has a problem because they've done all this negative net present value investment, financial system's a mess. But in the short run, they have all these reserves, so everything will be fine. Well, in economics, the line between the short term and the long term, we don't exactly know where that is. And my biggest concern is we could be looking at a massive problem in China in the next few years, and I don't think our policy community is ready for it.
I really disagree with this notion. I'm nervous about having my economic Lord Chamberlain moment here. that China is the bad guy that has been touted in public policy. And this is something that both sides do. The Obama administration has been trying to sell the TPP by arguing we have to do this or China's going to eat our lunch. Secretary Clinton was talking about her infrastructure plan, which I'm a big fan of, by the way, arguing that we don't do this, China's going to eat our lunch. You know, I just don't think that's particularly realistic. And in fact, I would argue that China is in a better place vis-a-vis the United States than it was when Bill Clinton was elected president, because then they really were managing their currency big time to the tune of large trade deficits. Now we still have big trade deficits with China, but I think their currency is pretty well aligned. I also don't agree that they've got the debt problem that Glenn suggests. And so, to the extent that China is our competitor, they're the same competitor. They're competing with us in the same way any other country is competing for market share around the globe. Now, they're a very big country and a very aggressive competitor, and I understand that. But this somehow setting up China as, you know, the boogeyman against which we must pass policy that blocks them is, in my view, mistaken. And I would argue that both in terms of economics, but even more in terms of geopolitics, we should really change our framework and think about cooperation.
Kira?
So I guess I'll disagree a little bit with Jared there to create some bipartisan harmony on this side. I mean, I think China's recent actions with its stock market should create a lot of concern. And the challenge we have for China, the challenge between the United States and China is really a fundamental worldview difference. China uses the power of the state, which is very large, to achieve its economic ends. And I think the thing that's been most interesting over the last couple of years is the switch amongst many business leaders in the United States who for a very long time saw China only as an opportunity and more recognize that China's mercantilist behavior or its actions to preferentially treat its own companies who are often run by leaders of the Communist Party who have huge amounts of say in the power structure of the United States. And my closest analogy between China's governing government and the United States is if you imagine the U.S. Congress being our top 50 billionaires. And, you know, both of those powers were collided into one, which would be, to me, more disconcerting than it is today. So, you know, I think the challenge is a really fundamental one. We litigate all these issues like state-owned enterprises and currency and all these other issues back and forth, but we have a fundamental challenge, which is we are basically operating in a free market economy, and China is operating in a very different structure, which is using the power of the state to help its economic interests, and often we lose head-to-head between American companies that don't have the power of the state in particular instances, and Chinese interests. So I think that is just a global issue we have to address. And by continually kind of litigating them on a issue-by-issue basis, we tend not to do well overall.
So, Nira, if you could pick the 50 billionaires, would you prefer them to the current Congress?
You know, even I would say no to that.
All right,
that's way too much power.
So we have a mic here and one there. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions as terse as you can. Why don't we start over here? Tell us who you are and remember that questions end with a question mark.
Hi, good morning. Michael Kirsch. Question about Hillary Clinton's infrastructure bank proposal. Glenn Hubbard, on your website, you have an article that critiques that proposal, saying that it would probably create the same bubble of long-term liabilities. Maybe that's not exactly what you said, but
I've
similar
never written
to
on Hillary Clinton's infrastructure proposal at all.
Well, if it wasn't yours, then it was.
Then maybe it was
I
not.
was critical of it.
Okay, maybe
well,
it's-
let me
mildly
just
critical.
so the idea was
Critical is important.
that it's going to create too many long-term liabilities like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And my question is, couldn't it be argued that the creation of long-term liabilities for infrastructure could be done with much better precision than Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Couldn't an infrastructure be done that would not create the same type of risks in the system? And if so, then what type of measures should be incorporated in a new infrastructure bank that would ensure that
Okay, so let me.
these would be profitable?
I did not write on
for the
this, but I
economy?
have a view. Can I
Okay,
answer
fair
it?
enough. So it's kind of like de novo. You are writing about it now.
This minute. So the way I think about infrastructure financing, we've tended to think of this as public sector or federal public sector, all in or all out. Think about this as tranches of cash flows in a project, some of which are riskless, others of which might have some risk, and others of which might be very risky. Normally in financing, we call the risky part equity, and then we put other securities on top of that. So one way to do this might be to do exactly that with an infrastructure bank involved only in pieces, and then have much more of a relationship with states.
So Glenn, first of all, it scares me a little bit, the tranching of credits. I heard that before. It didn't enter. What the federal government is clearly able to borrow at very low interest rates and always borrows at less than the private sector. The problem with infrastructure is not financing, it's making sure we have good projects.
That's why the state involvement is so critical.
Because you think the states are better than the federal
Much better, much better.
So I've been mildly critical of the infrastructure part of infrastructure bank part of Ms. Clinton's infrastructure proposal, which I generally think is a very strong proposal, and it's $250 billion over 5 years, and then another 25 on top of that to capitalize an infrastructure bank. Very briefly, my issue is more the idea that if you have private investors involved in an infrastructure bank and funding public infrastructure, they typically have to get a return on their investment, and that means your infrastructure has to generate user fees, and that adds a complication that is not always welcomed. On the other hand, here's the reason why an infrastructure bank is a good idea that you don't hear enough, and this is a government failure problem. The extent of siloing within agencies is unknown to anyone who hasn't actually gone into this. And in my experience in government, we were once trying to talk about a bridge that had a railway going through it. So it was a bridge for autos, but it had a railway. And boy, that was way more complicated than it should have been. And there's an idea that an infrastructure bank would help sort of de-silo some of those dysfunctions.
Okay.
So, can I just say, I mean, I'm not a fan of this, but it's on exactly the point Jerry was making. This is an attempt to take federal spending outside the political process. That's just wrong.
Yeah.
You shouldn't do that. You should make good policy, good politics, and you should run it through the Congress and get it done right. This is always a mistake.
All right, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then hope that everybody doesn't have to answer every question. The gentleman right here, and then the gentleman in front of him, and then we'll go to this side.
Thank you. My name is Peter Gluck, and my question focuses on the phrase that's been used several times by the panel, the American people need to decide, because that to me suggests that there's some kind of national referendum on each of these policy issues, when clearly we elect our representatives and senators in districts and states, and what they have chosen since 2010 is paralysis. So how does that affect your thinking about how these economic challenges are going to be decided by policymakers?
Okay, thank you. You can pass the mic to the gentleman in front of you.
Hi, good morning. John Paul Giraldo from the University of Central Florida. I have a quick question about Bernie Sanders' universal health care proposal. Does it make economic sense?
Okay, and there's a woman on the aisle here. Thanks.
Good morning, I'm June O'Connell. If you accept that since the Great Recession, there was a perception that everyone was hurt, but everyone hasn't recovered equally, and that things are benefiting from overseas, to your original question to start this discussion, what would you say to a president who committed to ending call centers overseas and pledged to change the tax structure that allowed that, and to pledge to return those jobs to the United States, and a president who pledged to end tax structures that benefited the flight of American
Okay,
headquarters overseas?
Okay, so first, anybody want to stand up for Bernie Sanders' health care plan?
I wanted to say one thing. Oh, you go. I wanted to. Quick thing.
No.
So I think to be 100% fair to Bernie Sanders' healthcare plan, it is absolutely the case that other countries have single-payer healthcare systems and spend less money overall and have have better healthcare outcomes, in part because they can align interests around investments and prevention because there's a single payer. He does call for increasing premium. I mean, basically does transfer the premium costs that everyone pays to the government and the individual. So you do pay premium costs. It would then become a tax liability. You know, my own view is that lots of people struggle to get to the Affordable Care Act, and so throwing all that out for a single payer system is politically difficult to do and really not worth it. But I just want to treat it on the merits that a lot of people have attacked the tax issue, and I think that's relevant. It is an increase in taxes, but it supplants the premiums you would pay.
Okay.
Very, very quickly, I'll be very brief, because I have a different view. I actually think, I view Bernie Sanders' plan as Medicare for all. I actually think that's a very good idea. It would, the fact is that cost growth in Medicare is considerably and consistently much slower than it is in the private sector. So it would actually overall save money for the economy and increase efficiency, because unlike Doug, I actually think Medicare has made some very important and efficiency-increasing reforms, which I can get into if you want, but you probably don't want to right now.
You're right. All right, so the gentleman asked, so we do have a presidential election, and we do choose between people with portfolios of policies, but we do seem to have, as a country, elected a bunch of people who can't get anything done. So how does that square with the American people need to decide this stuff?
I think there's two answers. One is we have to have a discussion, and because the discussion is painful, it will happen only when voters, the media, and so on force politicians. But we need more. We need more rules in the budget process that do things that may sound arcane, from lengthening the window over which a budget is made to putting so-called mandatory spending, entitlement spending on the budget for decisions with overall budget caps. Once you have rules, then politicians have to make decisions. Whether they decide to raise taxes or cut spending, that's political. None of us can help with that. But if you force the choice, you'll get the choice.
But is there anything that you see in the campaign so far that leads you to believe we're having that kind of discussion?
No, because no candidate, well, there are several candidates who have served up versions of it, but we're not hearing a national discussion, in large part because we aren't asking for it.
I think this is, I mean, maybe I guess most of us have actually been on campaigns at one point or another as advisors or actually on the staff of the campaigns. I mean, the fundamental challenge we have is we have two different electorates in a presidential cycle and an off-year election, right? So in the last several of them, in 2008, you had one composition of people voting. In 2010, you had a different composition. 2012, one composition. You have this second composition, 2014. And the truth is that the parties, I don't think there's a failure of political leaders just not negotiating these things, or they're all terrible, despite what you want to hear, what you hear in politics. The reality is that the parties are farther apart than they've ever been on really core fundamental issues. And the reality is, in 2016, we'll face a Donnybrook election. What's weird about the moment we're in is that the parties are moving farther apart. I mean, usually you have a presidential cycle, the third term of any party, and the opposing party has moved closer to the center in response. Whatever you say about this, and I'm not to be critical or anything, but the 2012 Republican Party moved to the right of 2008, and the 2016 debate is to the right of 2012. It is an unusual occurrence in politics for that to happen. Richard Nixon in 1968 had moved his party domestically leftward from Barry Goldwater. So if you think about these things, we are in a unique moment because the parties and really the people, and you can see it every day in the discussion we're having. It's like everyone in Washington wants to say political leaders just don't listen. They are listening too much. And the bases of the parties are moving in opposite directions. And I will say what I said at the beginning. I think that is because, in my view, it might be a whole host of international issues, et cetera, But I think that is because after 15 years of wage stagnation, the parties are responding in different ways. This will sound a little critical, but I think Republican-based voters are more anxious about the other. And that's why you see a debate about immigration and Islamophobia, all these other issues. That's my sense of it. Democrats are more concerned about rising inequality than at any point in the last 20 years. And that is roiling both parties, and they are moving. So that is why I would say to the next president, you have to solve this problem because the country, the politics are going to get more and more and more disruptive until you do.
Can I agree with that? And there's a layer on that. I think that's brilliant analysis. But remember, within the parties, there's also this split. There's a struggle now for who owns the Republican Party brand, and
Yes.
who is going to be seen as a Republican. Same's true on the left, right? The progressives are further left than many of the others. The blue dogs are all gone, and so there are these two parties with these missing middles at the moment. So the primaries are chaotic. That will ultimately get sorted out, and there will be a general with as Neera described, very different visions on how to solve the problems that everyone recognizes are real. But that's a good thing. This is the teachable moment. That's why I think presidential elections are so important. They're going to have to come down to some decision as a candidate on what they're going to promise to do when president, because there are real issues that have to be dealt with, and the American people will ultimately have to make some decisions. They will.
One party is a little less chaotic than the other. I need to point that out.
I think that's a statement.
But that's not really true. If you guys still ran the House, you'd have a mess because you couldn't. You have the same division. That caucus is just as divided as the one the public sees, just because Republicans are in the majority.
So is there something we could do with tax policy or something else that would discourage companies from taking jobs overseas? And if so, should we do it?
I'm glad you asked that. I had forgotten that question. I thought that was an important point, and it's very timely, by the way, because in the paper this morning there's an article about an idea that's been floating around. Steve Rosenthal, TPC, thought of this, and Hillary Clinton apparently is now signing on to this idea. And the idea is that when it's an anti-inversion idea, and kind of what one of the things you're talking about here is this idea of corporate inversion, where companies essentially move their tax address to another company to take advantage of lower rates there, but basically keep their operations here. And there are a number of policy tweaks that would block that, but one that was suggested this morning by Ms. Clinton I thought was very strong, and that was if you're going to invert, you have to pay a very significant exit fee, meaning a one-time fee on all of your earnings, your overseas earnings that have yet to be, quote, repatriated to come back here. So you have this $2 trillion plus deferred foreign earnings sitting overseas. Having that kind of a toll booth is one idea that would help. There are many more, but I think it's a good idea.
So, Glenn, I'm not sure that would do much to keep jobs here. Should the tax code discourage American firms from moving jobs overseas?
Well, I think the quickest way to do that would be to do actual tax reform that actually brought the U.S. rate down. I wouldn't have trouble in such a reform having a toll charge on accumulated earnings and profits from the past. But rather than doing it one-off by inversion, why don't we admit the problem we have? Your question about call centers, I think the market is largely working there as wages have risen abroad. You're seeing what's called smart shoring sometimes, of bringing back call centers from overseas locations to lower cost areas of the United States. So that one I think the market is actually getting.
Okay, let's take a gentleman over here. There's two over here and then one on the aisle. So why don't you go to the aisle? Gentleman on the aisle, could you raise your hand so the microphone can find you? Thank you.
Thank you, Nick Farmer. Can you speak to the broad implications of technological change in some more detail? That is, looking at things like big data, Internet of Things, robotics, and the impact on job creation. Look at companies like Uber, Airbnb, Google, create tremendous market cap, very few jobs.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Isn't the world changing in more dramatic and fundamental ways than you've acknowledged? And can't this be the driver, along with demographics, to things like productivity, interest rates, GDP growth? And people, I think, are looking at things in the light of the 1950s, and they should be thinking about it in light of the 2030s.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman on the aisle here.
Tad Howard. I would like to agree with this gentleman because the big companies last century, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Boeing, they created thousands of jobs, and the Twitters and the Googles are creating hundreds of jobs. So we've got a basic problem. But I see a bigger problem, and I've got a list of 75 middle-class jobs I see disappearing, but I'll cite two. One apparently is that the leading category for male occupation in this country is driver, either driver of a truck or driver of a cab. Those are both being challenged by self-driving cars, which are licensed, I believe, now in Nevada. And you got self-driving trucks at Fort Hood. And 10 years from now, we're going to have self-driving trucks and self-driving cars. The other thing I see is in Canada, Canada's already announced that over the next 10 years, they're going to discontinue to-the-door delivery of mail in a lot of areas. If we were to do that, there would be a massive cutback in employment. And I could go on and on and on, but there's a whole bunch of social and IT solutions. And the other thing is, if the minimum wage goes higher, the incentive to convert is that much greater.
Okay, so let's draw the line at those. Those are like mega book questions altogether, so let me try and break them apart. So both the questioners raised this thing, which you hear quite a bit, is that we're at some point now in technological change where we are going to basically not have enough jobs, that self-driving cars and elaborate artificial intelligence we just won't have enough jobs to go around. If the president-elect asked you, should he or she worry about that, what would you say?
I would say there are some things we should do about that, but I wouldn't put it nearly as high on the list as you two gentlemen, with great respect for your knowledge of this, which I can see is deep. First of all, I'm skeptical of the extent to which the pace at which labor-saving technology is entering the workforce. The presumption behind both of your questions is that that pace is accelerating. That is, labor-displacing technology is entering the workforce at a faster rate. I think you would agree that that's the implication of your question. Well, if so, why is productivity growth slowing down? And not just slowing down a little, and not just slowing down for a few months, but slowing down a lot for a considerable period of time. If what you're saying is true, we should have accelerating productivity growth. We should have faster output per hour, but we're not. So there's something a little bit ungepatched about the idea, just to start out with.
So you have to translate that.
Term, or
yeah, that's
wrong.
It's not a Presbyterian term. I think we can
It's
establish.
definitely not Presbyterian. I think we're trying to add diversity to the panel. But at the same time, I would remind the president that if I were Thomas Jefferson's chief economist, I would have run into him and said, "Sir, there's 90% of our jobs are in agriculture, and I've just looked at a crystal ball, and in 2015 it's 1.5% emergency." And I would have been wrong, as the Luddites have historically been wrong. The missing variable is demand. Demand is weak. Growth needs to be faster. The only thing that I would submit to the president and to you is that we really need to upskill our workforce, and I think we would all agree that that would help to the extent that this is a problem and that I'm wrong. The more we increase the complementarities between people's skills and the technology out there, we would improve the situation. But I'm more concerned about the intervening variable, which is just enough demand.
But Larry Summers has made the point that there is an unusual phenomenon. We have companies creating lots of market value with very little capital and very little labor. And he suggests that maybe this isn't going to be like the last round. But Jared thinks Larry's wrong. Anybody?
I think he's wrong. Yeah. We've never had one kind of company, one size fits all. There are companies with all sorts of different structures, and that's very healthy. I would say the two things out of this that I'd highlight would be, number one, not that we have the Googles and Twitters and that. What we don't have is the rate of startups that we used to have, of small growing companies that have been traditional vehicles for employment, and that's something worth worrying a lot about, I think. Yeah. And the second is, for the men who are drivers, everyone in this audience should read a paper by David Autor and a co-author out of Third Way called Wayward Sons, which just details the dismal state of male education, work, and labor force achievement in the United States, and the really troubling outlook if we don't change these trends. So I'd focus on the people. I'm not worried about the technologies.
Mm-hmm. Gentleman there and a woman in here. Can you bring the mic down, the woman in the third row? Thank you. Can you make sure that's on?
Hi, I'm Rick Rybeck with Just Economics. Wanted to get the panel's take on sort of marrying infrastructure with rent seeking. Most people would agree the metro rail system in the Washington, D.C. region was a great boon for productivity, and it cost about $10 billion to build it. By conservative estimates, created more than $10 billion in land values around the stations. So theoretically, it could have financed itself. But instead, the vast majority of its value is appropriated by people who are lucky or shrewd enough to own commercial land around the stations. And so this gets to inequality too, because as a taxpayer, I pay to create Metro, but if I really want to use it, I want to have my house or my business next to stop. So I go to landlord with a fistful of dollars. I say, here's my first month's rent. Landlord says, well, that would rent you anywhere else in the region, but here you're next to Metro. You go, oh, of course. So you pay a rent premium in order to have access to the infrastructure you've already paid for in your taxes. I'm not implying that it isn't worth more. I'm just saying the landlord shouldn't be getting that value. It should be going back to Metro. And this ability of private owners to appropriate that publicly created value is the fuel for land speculation, which pretty much dooms a lot of the things that we might do to uplift the minimum wage or do infrastructure projects. The end result of both of those would be higher rents, and we'd be no better off than we were before unless we get that publicly created value to come back. I'm just
Okay, thank you.
want the panel.
Hi, I'm Sharon Kotak, and it seems that in the United States, we've kind of lost that belief that we're all in this together, and that the rich are better off even when the middle class and the poor are better off as well. Is there anything that we can do to get that feeling back that we're all in this together?
Okay, anybody? Land tax?
Henry George.
Henry George, he had it right, yeah. Only one municipality in the United States uses land tax. It's Pittsburgh. It's where I grew up. Very sane, very sensible.
Their relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just sane, sensible people doing the right thing.
The only thing else add to that is it is interesting the way in which you're now starting to see people concerned about inequality bring this into the mix in just the way you did. Paul Krugman had a recent column where he said, when you're thinking about the things that generate inequality, we should also think about these dynamics. So I think you raise a good point. The only thing I'll say about we're in this together is that I wrote a book, which I commend to you, which tried to answer that question. It was called...
We're in this together.
Yeah, it was called, I forget what it was called. But
Oh, my Lord.
Oh, my God.
it was named
Your
after
agent is calling.
Oh, we're all together now. Common sense for a fair economy. And the book was structured around, obviously a memorable book. The book was structured around two ideas.
The great title.
The book was structured around two ideas. One was that there are a bunch of yo-yos out there. You're on your own. And the other is we're in this together, the wits. So it's wits versus yo-yos. And I think through your question in that book, and you can see if it resonates with you.
All right, let me.
Can I answer? I think about this question a lot, and I think the challenge we have about this is, so from my perspective, we have a demand problem. We kind of have a bit of what I would characterize as a free rider problem. The incentive structure for every company is to lower its costs. Hillary did a speech on long-termism. CAP has written a lot about this. Investment in workers, business investment in workers, training is down 30% in a decade. Healthcare costs, employers are shifting costs to employees. Wages are stuck. Because really, a company, the incentive structure for every company is to say, they have to make quarterly assessments. Stock market wants to see high profitability. 59% of management today says that they would not make a long-term investment even though they know it's good for the firm, if the Wall Street would say it's bad for them. I think we do have a challenge. Business investment is low, even though profitability is high, or it's middling. Usually those correspond. I do think we have a kind of broad challenge, which is that the incentive structure within firms is for everyone to lower costs as much as possible, which makes companies very profitable, which is we want companies to be profitable. But at the same time, we have a demand challenge in the country. A lot of those companies would be better off if there were higher wages in the country. And we have to kind of figure out whether there's things we're doing in public policy that makes that out of whack.
Okay.
So, I think at the end of the day, we have to look at these things. We do have a rise of share buybacks. There are a lot of challenges we have to think through. It's not going to be one lever or another. But I think, again, what people feel like things are out of whack because they kind of are.
So I think we managed to make 90 minutes interesting, despite your suspicions that we couldn't, Nira.
I was really worried about you, David.
Okay.
Let's just be clear where the criticism was.
Okay, got it. Well, I hope I lived up to your expectations. I want to ask you each to end on one question. So, if we were in one of those presidential town hall meetings where the candidates are on the stage and people here in the audience were the people who were just plucked completely by random, not screened by anybody, as we know these things work, what one question would you like to hear the candidates respond to on this broad question of economics? Maybe I start with you, Jaron.
What one question would I want to hear?
What would you pose if there were candidates up here and you could ask one question of them?
I hear you talking about growth, and I'm all for growth, but unless that growth is more equitably shared, it's not that interesting to me as somebody sitting in this audience. So what steps are you going to take to reconnect? What's your reconnection agenda to reconnect growth and more broadly shared prosperity?
That's basically the same thing without the snarkier tone. I think I would say that
you got to get to a town hall.
We want,
that was pretty nice.
We need higher growth, but how do we have higher growth that's more inclusive?
Mm-hmm.
What Glenn said, only snarkier.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the basic question.
Great.
Shared
All right,
prosperity.
there you go. So we agree. All right, please join me in thanking the panel and thank you for your questions. In the interest of shared harmony at Brookings, if you look at your feet and there are cups or papers or paper plates there, pick them up and put them in the recycling. Thank you.